The Man in the Worn Leather Jacket. This is a dramatized, fictionalized motivational story inspired by the atmosphere of classic Hollywood productions and the emotional truths many veterans carried home from World War II. It is not presented as verified history. It's a respectful narrative about empathy, integrity, and the responsibility of art to honor human experience. April 1958 felt like Lowe's angels had forgotten how to breathe. The heat didn't slam down like summer. This was the slow, persistent kind that crawled under your collar and stayed there, turning studio lights into a second sun and making a soundstage feel like a sealed box. Inside 20th Century Fox, the crew of the Young Lions moved with that special exhaustion that only comes from ambition fighting reality. You could feel it in the way grips walked a little faster than normal, in the way assistants whispered instead of spoke, and in the way a director's clipboard seemed heavier every hour it stayed in his hands. A war film was supposed to look controlled on set, disciplined, precise, like a mission. But this one, was a storm disguised as a production schedule. The budget kept swelling, the days kept stretching, and the pressure came down from upstairs like a hand squeezing a throat. Get it done, keep it clean, don't make it complicated, don't make it messy, don't make it harder than people want. Edward Dmytryk, brilliant, brittle, and running on stubborn will, was trying to keep the whole machine from breaking apart. He had the look of a man who'd been through too much to be easily impressed, but not enough to be numb. He carried guilt the way some men carried cigarettes, always between his fingers, always present even when he wasn't actively using it. He could handle ego, he could handle delays, he could handle studio memos with polite poison in every sentence. What he could not handle, what he could not afford, was a scene that refused to become real. And right now, the scene was refusing. They were filming a training sequence. The cockpit mock-up, the projected sky, the illusion of airfields sliding past like memory. Dean Martin sat in the pilot seat dressed in an Army Air Forces uniform, his hair perfect the way the camera loved it, the collar tight enough to remind him he wasn't playing himself. He had the stick in his hand, his mouth shaped around lines that were supposed to sound like fear and reluctance and the first tremors of courage. On paper, it worked. On paper, it was clean. But on the stage, under the lights, in front of all those eyes, the moment felt like an actor showing fear instead of a man containing it. Dean did what professionals did. He hit his marks, he delivered the lines, he tried again and again with minor adjustments, sweat collecting at his temples and in the hollow of his throat where confidence usually lived. Each take ended with Dmytryk's jaw tightening a fraction more, and each reset felt like a prayer they all knew wouldn't be answered. Marlon Brando lingered at the edge of the soundstage like a quiet judge, arms folded, watching with that unsettling intensity that made people feel examined rather than seen. Montgomery Clift sat nearby, script in hand, shoulders slightly hunched, the posture of someone whose body hurt in ways that didn't show up on camera until you looked too closely. The crew pretended not to watch the actors watching each other because everybody knew this was a high-wire act. Talent, trauma, ambition, and the studio's expectations all strung together above a fall no one wanted to imagine. Dean could feel it, the unspoken question behind every silence. Can he do it? Can he carry the serious weight? Can he be more than the charming man who makes it look easy? By the 18th attempt, Dean's frustration had become something heavier than anger. It was that private kind of panic a person gets when they realize the thing they want most, the thing they need to prove, is the very thing slipping away no matter how tightly they reach for it. He gripped the control stick harder as if strength could substitute for truth, and he heard Dmytryk's voice from somewhere outside the cockpit. Less surface, more underneath. But that note was like telling someone drowning to relax. Dean tried. He tried again. And when the set went quiet for another reset, he felt the shame of a grown man who couldn't find the right door inside himself, even though he'd been famous for opening doors with a smile. That was when the back door clicked. At first, it didn't register as anything unusual. Doors opened all the time, crew came and went, smoke breaks happened, equipment was hauled in. But this was different. The sound wasn't just a hinge, it was interruption. A silhouette slipped in from the exterior lot, and the air on the soundstage changed as if someone had opened a window to a different world. The man who stepped inside did not belong to the machinery of Hollywood. He moved with a limp that was old enough to have stopped being dramatic, the kind of limp that wasn't performed for sympathy. His face was weathered in a way makeup artists tried to replicate, but could never fully understand. Lines carved by wind and worry and the long, slow aftermath of things you don't talk about at dinner. Over his shoulders, he wore a worn leather bomber jacket, cracked and faded, the kind of jacket that carried history in every crease. It didn't hang on him like costume. It sat on him like identity. He walked straight toward the cockpit mock-up with the calm authority of someone who had walked toward far worse. A few crew members noticed and started to move, but hesitation caught them. On a set, confidence is a uniform. If someone wears it well enough, people assume they're supposed to be there. The man stopped near the mock-up, looked up at Dean in the pilot's seat, and studied his hands on the stick like a mechanic watching someone misuse a sacred tool. The silence deepened, not because anyone had been ordered to be quiet, but because everyone sensed the presence of something real. The man's gaze stayed locked on Dean for a long moment. Then he spoke with a voice that carried without shouting, steady as if it had once carried orders over engines. "That's not how a pilot holds a control stick," he said, and the sentence hit the soundstage like a slap. "You're going to crash the plane before you even get it off the ground." The set froze, even Brando uncrossed his arms. Clift lifted his head as if pulled by a string. Dimitrich's face flared hot with instant outrage, the reflex of a man defending his territory. "Security!" he snapped, stepping forward. "Get him out of here." But Dean didn't look at Dimitrich. Dean looked at the stranger. And in the stranger's words, Dean heard something he hadn't heard all day, certainty that came from lived experience, not direction notes, not acting theory, not studio expectations. The man's eyes stayed on Dean, and he continued, not rude, not loud, just undeniable. "You're strangling it, like it's an enemy. A plane isn't a beast you wrestle. It's a thing you guide, firm, sure, but gentle, like you're holding something alive." Two guards started forward, but Dean lifted one hand, palm out. The guards hesitated, surprised that the actor in the cockpit was stopping them. Dean's voice came softer than the moment demanded, but it carried anyway. "Who are you?" The stranger finally took his eyes off the stick and looked at the crowd with a kind of quiet, tired pride. "Captain James Mackenzie," he said, and the name sounded plain, like the names real men had before headlines turned people into symbols. "United States Army Air Forces, retired B-17 pilot, 8th Air Force. I've held a stick in the sky when the sky wanted to kill me. And I'm telling you, son, if you hold it like that, you don't make it home." Dimitrich bristled as if the words had personally insulted his entire crew. "Captain, I don't care if this is a closed set. You're trespassing." Mackenzie turned to Dimitrich for the first time. His eyes were sharp and clear, the opposite of his limp, like the injury never reached his mind. "Then arrest me," he said, calm as stone. "But don't make a war movie if you don't want the truth standing in the room." That sentence did something strange to the air. The crew didn't cheer or react. Hollywood people were too trained for that, but you could see it in their faces: curiosity, discomfort, respect. Brando stepped closer, not as a star, but like a student approaching a teacher he didn't know he needed. "What else are we getting wrong?" Brando asked, voice low. Dimitrich threw up a hand. "We have advisors, we have consultants." Mackenzie looked back at Dean again and spoke in a way that landed like a lesson rather than an argument. "Your actor is playing fear like it's a performance," he said. "But fear isn't something a pilot shows the world. A pilot hides it because everyone else is watching. If the pilot looks scared, the crew falls apart. You don't survive by being fearless. You survive by acting steady while your insides try to climb out of your skin. That's the truth. That's what breaks men." Dean felt something click in his chest, like a locked door finally giving way. That was it. That was exactly what he'd been missing. He had been displaying fear when the character needed to bury it. He had been trying to convince the audience he was afraid instead of letting the audience feel the pressure of a man pretending he is. It wasn't technique he needed. It was honesty, the kind you couldn't fake unless you understood what it cost. Dean's voice came out before he could second-guess it. "Show me," he said. Mackenzie blinked, surprised. "Show you what?" "How to sit, how to hold it," Dean said, and the words came faster now, urgent, like he was afraid the moment would vanish if he didn't grab it. "How you hide it, how you keep your face calm when your stomach is trying to betray you. Show me, Captain." Dimitrich looked like he wanted to swallow the entire stage out of spite. He checked his watch, his favorite weapon against anything human. "We don't have time for—" "5 minutes," Dean cut in, not loud, but firm enough that even Dimitrich paused. Dean looked at him with an intensity the director hadn't seen from him all morning. "Give me 5 minutes. If it doesn't help, we go back. But if it does, we stop wasting time pretending." Dimitrich stared at Dean, saw something real there, something the studio couldn't buy, and he exhaled through his nose like surrender. 5, he said. Then he leaves. Mackenzie approached the cockpit ladder slowly. His limp made the climb look painful, but he refused help when a crew member instinctively stepped forward. He took it step by step like a man who'd learned that pride was sometimes the only thing that kept you upright. When he finally lowered himself into the pilot's seat, something subtle happened. His shoulders straightened, his hands found the controls like they remembered him, and the age in his face softened as if the cockpit had turned back time. He didn't look like a visitor now. He looked like a man who belonged to the sky. "First thing," he said, adjusting the seat as if it were real. "You're sitting like you're driving to the grocery store. A pilot sits like he's listening, upright, engaged. You need to feel the plane, you need to see everything." He demonstrated with small movements that said more than any lecture could. The position of the spine, the placement of the feet, the subtle readiness in the shoulders. Then he placed his hand on the stick, not gripping, not clenching, resting it with a calm, practiced ease. "This isn't a fight," he said. "This is a conversation. You hold it like you're holding a bird, firm enough it can't fly off, gentle enough you're not crushing it." Dean watched like a man watching his own reflection finally stop lying. "And the fear?" Dean asked quietly, because suddenly it felt like the most important question of his life. Kenzie's expression shifted, not dramatic, just a shadow passing over a field. "Before every mission," he said, voice steady, "I threw up every time. My crew knew I'd be in the latrine emptying my stomach like a clock. Then I climbed into the cockpit and I smiled like everything was fine. Because if I didn't, 10 men behind me would look at my face and decide whether they could survive the day. So I kept busy. Instruments, checklists, procedures. I made my hands do work so they didn't shake." He looked at Dean and the set around them felt miles away. "That's what you should play, not panic, control under pressure, the mask, the cost of the mask." The soundstage had become a church, without anyone agreeing to pray. Clift's voice came from his chair, careful as glass. "What was it really like?" he asked, and it didn't sound like an actor asking for research. It sounded like a man asking for a truth he needed to hear. Mackenzie didn't answer immediately. His hand remained on the stick, but his eyes went somewhere far beyond the painted sky. When he spoke, his words came with a weight that changed the temperature of the room. "It was loud," he said softly. "It was cold. It was long hours staring at a world you couldn't touch, and it was pressing a button and knowing you'd done something you could never undo." He swallowed once, and Dean saw how the throat moved like it was pushing down a memory. "People call you a hero when you come home," Mackenzie continued, "but they don't know what you see at night. They don't know what it does to you when you realize you can't tell the difference between duty and damage anymore." Dimitrich stood frozen, watch forgotten. Brando's eyes were fixed on Mackenzie like he was watching the real film for the first time. The crew, men and women who'd been building fake wars out of wood and paint, were now staring at the cost of the real one. Mackenzie climbed out of the cockpit with effort, the limp returning as soon as he left the seat. He stood on the ground and looked around at the set, the lights, the fake sky. For a moment his face held something like grief, then he looked at Dean again. "If you want to do this right," he said, "you don't just need to hold the stick correctly. You need to understand what it means to keep your face calm while your soul cracks." He paused and his voice lowered. "And if your studio thinks war is only glory, they'll try to cut the truth out of you." Dean stepped down from the mock-up, heart pounding. "Come back tomorrow," he said, "please." Dimitrich started to object, but his voice didn't come. Because he could feel it too, the undeniable thing that had entered the room, authenticity. Mackenzie studied Dean, searching for the usual Hollywood hunger, publicity, performance, ego. What he found instead was a man who wanted to be worthy of the story he was borrowing. Finally, Mackenzie nodded once. "I'll come back," he said, "but I'm not going to sanitize it. I'm not going to make it pretty." Dean's reply came without hesitation, and the words sounded like the beginning of a different kind of courage. "Then don't," he said. "Maybe the truth is what we're missing." Mackenzie turned toward the exit, limp steady, jacket creaking softly with each step. Just before he reached the door, he stopped and looked back over his shoulder. "One more thing," he said, and his eyes locked on Dean with a seriousness that sliced through the entire soundstage. "That scene you're struggling with? The fear isn't the problem. The problem is what comes after, the part nobody wants to show, the part that follows you home." And with that, he walked out, leaving behind a room full of people who suddenly realized they hadn't been making a movie that morning. They'd been avoiding a truth. Dean stood there, hands still tingling as if the control stick were still under his palm, and for the first time since production began, he didn't feel like he was failing. He felt like he'd been given a door, one that led somewhere harder, darker, and far more meaningful than anything the studio had planned. And somewhere deep inside him, behind the smooth grin and the effortless charm, something honest woke up and whispered, "If you do this right, it might cost you, but if you don't, It'll cost you even more. The weight that doesn't come home. The next morning, the studio lot woke the way it always did, trucks backing into bays, electricians hoisting lights like they were lifting small suns, assistants jogging with clipboards already full of problems. On the surface, it was just another day in the machine. But on Soundstage 7, something had shifted. The air didn't feel like production anymore. It felt like anticipation. Dean arrived earlier than usual, long before makeup, long before wardrobe, and stood alone near the cockpit mock-up with his hands in his pockets, studying the seat where Captain Mackenzie had sat the day before. It looked ordinary now, painted metal, rivets, dials that spun for the camera. Yesterday, it had been a confession booth, a time machine, a place where a man who had actually lived inside death had placed his hands and spoken truth without caring who liked it. Dean hadn't slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Mackenzie's hand on the stick, light but certain, and heard his voice saying the words that kept echoing. "What follows you home?" Mackenzie arrived at 7 sharp. He walked in through the same side door, not sneaking this time, but not announced either, his worn bomber jacket already familiar, his limp steady and unembarrassed. A few crew members noticed him immediately and nodded as if he were part of the production now, which in a way he was. Dean spotted him from across the stage and crossed the floor before anyone else could intercept. They shook hands, and Dean felt the grip, firm, not performative, the grip of a man who had once been responsible for 10 other lives at a time. "I'm glad you came," Dean said, and meant more than politeness. Mackenzie studied him for a moment, then nodded. "So am I," he replied. "Means you weren't just being kind yesterday." They didn't go to the director. They didn't go to wardrobe or hair. They went to Dean's trailer. Inside, away from the lights and the manufactured noise, the small space felt like a confession chamber, coffee on a side table, a couch that had heard too many lines rehearsed into emptiness. Dean gestured for Mackenzie to sit, then poured them both coffee even though Mackenzie hadn't asked. For a moment, they just listened to the distant hum of the studio, the sound of a place where people made stories for a living. Then Dean spoke carefully, like a man stepping onto thin ice. "Yesterday," he said, "you said the fear isn't the problem, that it's what comes after. I think that's the movie we're not making yet." Mackenzie held the warm cup in both hands, letting the heat seep into his fingers. His eyes rested on the wall as if it were a screen. "Most war movies," he said, "end with a parade or a kiss or a man walking away while music tells you what to feel. They stop before the real story starts. They stop before the silence, before the nights, before the years." He took a slow breath. "When you come home, nobody teaches you how to live with what you did. They just tell you to be proud." Dean leaned forward, "And you were." Mackenzie's mouth tightened, not in anger, but in something older. "Pride is a word people use when they don't want to talk about consequences," he said. "I was grateful to be alive, that's different. I was relieved, I was lucky, but proud," he shook his head. "Pride doesn't wake you up at 3 in the morning because you smell burning that isn't there. Pride doesn't make you look at your hands and wonder how something that can hold a child can also release death from the sky." Dean felt the words settle somewhere under his ribs, heavy and unmoving. "Tell me about the crew," he said. "You mentioned them yesterday." Mackenzie exhaled slowly, like a man opening a door he'd built to stay closed. "There were 10 of them," he said. 10 men who trusted me to get them home. You don't forget their faces, not ever." And then he started to talk. He told Dean about Tommy Chen, the tail gunner from San Francisco who wrote letters to a girlfriend who didn't exist because believing someone waited for him felt safer than admitting he might disappear without leaving anything behind. Tommy, who laughed too loud, who hummed when he was nervous, who once traded his dessert ration to a French kid through a fence because he couldn't stand the look in the boy's eyes. He told Dean about Marcus Washington, the radio operator who kept photos of his 3 children folded in his breast pocket and touched them before every mission like a prayer. A man who cried silently in his bunk at night because he was afraid his youngest wouldn't recognize him if he survived. He told him about Jack Sullivan, the bombardier who never missed and slowly stopped eating because he said food tasted like smoke, who drank black coffee until his hands shook, because sleeping meant seeing what his precision created. As Mackenzie spoke, Dean realized something unsettling. He wasn't hearing stories. He was being introduced to ghosts. These men weren't characters. They weren't types. They were unfinished lives, each with a voice that still lived in the way Mackenzie said their names. Most of them made it through the war, Mackenzie continued, staring into his coffee. That's what people think survival means. They came home. They got medals. They shook hands. And then they fell apart. He listed them quietly, not dramatically, the way a man reads names carved in stone. Tommy with a service pistol 3 months after returning, Marcus with a car and a tree in the dark, Jack with a bottle and a body that finally gave up at 32, Eddie the navigator who walked into the ocean and let it decide. The war didn't kill them in the air, Mackenzie said. It killed them slowly where nobody wanted to look. Dean felt his throat tighten. And you? He asked. Mackenzie's eyes lifted, tired but present. I'm still here, he said. That's all I can say. Some days that feels like luck, some days it feels like a debt. They sat in silence after that, not the awkward kind, but the kind that happens when something important has been said and both men know it. When they finally returned to the stage, the crew was already setting up for the day's work, but the work had changed. Dean didn't go straight to makeup. He walked to the cockpit mock-up and stood beside it, not climbing in yet, just looking at it like a man about to enter a space that required respect. Mackenzie stood a few feet away, watching him not as a critic, but as someone waiting to see if the lesson had landed. When Dean finally sat, he did it differently. His posture shifted without him forcing it. His shoulders settled. His hands rested on the controls the way Mackenzie had shown him, not tight, not theatrical, but ready. When Dimitric called action, Dean didn't perform fear. He performed order. He checked instruments. He spoke his lines with a steadiness that felt earned. And underneath it all there was tension, not the visible kind, but the kind that lives behind the eyes. The crew felt it immediately. You could see it in the way a boom operator forgot to adjust his pole, in the way Brando's head tilted slightly, interested. When Dimitric called cut, he didn't shout notes. He just stood there for a second, then nodded once. Again, he said quietly, not because it wasn't working, but because it was. They shot the scene in fewer takes than anyone expected. The difference wasn't technical, it was human. Dean had stopped trying to convince and started trying to contain. Between setups, Mackenzie spoke with him about small things, the way pilots joked before missions, the way men learned to read each other's silences, the way fear became a shared language no one admitted to speaking. By noon, the cockpit scene was done and something else had been born in its place, a partnership. Over the next weeks, Mackenzie became part of the rhythm of the production. He arrived early. He watched quietly. He spoke only when asked or when something felt wrong enough that silence would be a kind of lie. Dean spent every break he could with him, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting. The conversations went deeper. They moved past missions and into aftermath. Mackenzie talked about the first time he walked down a civilian street again and realized no one there knew what he had done, how strange it felt to buy groceries with hands that had once released bombs. He talked about marriage strained by things he couldn't explain, about a daughter he loved fiercely and feared he didn't deserve. He talked about the nights when he'd sit in the dark and count breaths until morning because sleep was not rest, it was return. Dean listened, and something in him shifted from curiosity to responsibility. Michael Whitaker was no longer just a role. He was a doorway. Dean began going to Dimitric with ideas, not demands, framed not as stardom but as story. He asked if they could let certain moments breathe, if they could soften triumph, if they could add hesitation where the script had certainty. Dimitric resisted at first, as directors do when they hear the word change spoken near a budget. But he also saw what was happening to his actor. He saw Dean moving into territory he had never inhabited on screen. He saw the performances deepen, darken, complicate. And he saw that whatever Mackenzie was giving them, it was something no consultant could supply. One afternoon, after Mackenzie described a particularly brutal mission and then fell silent, Dean said something that surprised even himself. "We're missing a scene," he said. Dimitric looked up from his notes. "We're missing about 20, he replied dryly. "No," Dean said. "I mean, we're missing this." He gestured between himself and Mackenzie. "We're showing what happens in the air, we're showing what happens in combat, but we're not showing what happens inside after. We don't show the moment when a man realizes he can't go back to who he was. We don't show the cost." Mackenzie watched him carefully. "You show it," he said. "People won't like it." "That doesn't mean it isn't necessary," Dean replied. They talked about it for days. A scene after a bombing run, not action, not spectacle, 2 men in a barracks, one new, one worn, a conversation no one prepared you for. Dean brought it to the screenwriter, to Dimitric, to the producer. Resistance met him at every step, dressed in words like tone and audience expectations and patriotism. But Dean didn't frame it as politics. He framed it as honesty. "If we don't show this," he said, "we're lying by omission. We're taking their fear and turning it into decoration." The arguments grew sharper. The schedule was already stretched. The studio would never approve a scene that made people uncomfortable. And then Dean said the words that shifted the ground beneath the conversation. Then shoot it anyway, he said. We'll argue later. They agreed reluctantly to hear Mackenzie out. One evening, in a small office with a tape recorder on the desk and cold coffee forgotten in cups, Mackenzie told them about a night after his third mission. He told them about sitting in an officers' club, hands shaking, trying to drown the images with noise and drink. He told them about an older pilot who sat beside him and spoke the words no one had dared to speak aloud. "We're not the good guys," Mackenzie said, repeating the sentence that had once split him open. "We're just the ones who are going to win, and because we're going to win, we get to tell the story." The room was silent except for the soft click of the recorder. The screenwriter took notes without looking up. Dimitrik's face was drawn, his eyes fixed somewhere far from the walls. Dean felt his chest tighten, not with fear, but with a sense of alignment he hadn't known he was missing. This was the scene. This was the weight. By the time Mackenzie finished, no one spoke for a long moment. Then the screenwriter cleared his throat and said quietly, "We can build this." And in that sentence, Dean heard something close to gratitude. That night, alone in his hotel room, Dean sat on the edge of the bed with the script in his lap and realized he wasn't nervous about acting anymore. He was nervous about deserving, about doing justice to something that wasn't his, about carrying, even briefly, a fragment of someone else's burden without turning it into entertainment. He thought about the way Mackenzie's crew had faded one by one, not on battlefields, but in kitchens and cars and bedrooms. He thought about how little space the world made for that kind of loss. And he understood, maybe for the first time, that what they were making was not just a movie. It was an argument with silence. Outside, Lowe's angels glittered, careless and bright. Inside, Dean Martin sat in the quiet with a war he had never fought and felt the strange, sobering honor of being trusted with its truth. The scene they didn't want. By the time the new scene took shape on paper, it no longer felt like an addition. It felt like a reckoning. The screenwriter worked late into the nights, shaping Mackenzie's memories into dialogue that didn't sound like speeches and didn't soften what they meant. Two men on bunks, no music, no swelling strings to tell the audience what to feel, just words and the space between them. Dean read the pages alone in his hotel room the first time, sitting in the armchair by the window while the city glowed below like 1,000 careless stars. Halfway through, he realized his jaw had tightened so hard it hurt. By the end, he was no longer seeing lines. He was hearing Mackenzie's voice. He was seeing Marcus's photographs, Tommy's letters, Jack's empty plate. He closed the script and sat there, still, because some part of him knew that if he moved too quickly, he would turn what he felt into something smaller than it deserved. The next day, the office where they gathered to discuss the scene was crowded with the wrong kind of energy. Producers, assistants, studio representatives, men who had built careers on understanding what audiences were ready for. They listened, arms crossed, brows furrowed, as Dimitrik laid out the idea. When he finished, one of the executives leaned back in his chair and exhaled through his nose. "It's dark," he said. "It's slow, and it turns our pilots into philosophers. People don't go to war movies to watch men talk about guilt. They go to feel courage." Dean didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Courage isn't always loud," he said. "Sometimes it's sitting on a bunk and admitting you don't know how to live with what you did." Another executive spoke about pacing, another about tone, another about the risk of alienating veterans. Mackenzie sat quietly at the end of the table, hands folded, eyes lowered. He didn't interrupt. He had lived long enough to know when people were speaking around something they didn't want to touch. When one of the men finally turned to him and asked, "Captain, do you really think audiences want to hear this?" Mackenzie lifted his head. His voice was not angry. It was steady, and that made it harder to dismiss. "Audiences include men like me," he said. "Men who spent years thinking there was something wrong with them because nobody else talked about this. You don't make this scene for comfort. You make it so people know they're not alone." Silence followed, not agreement, not approval, but something had landed. They were given permission to shoot it, though the words were wrapped in caution. They were reminded it might never make the final cut. Dean accepted that risk without relief. He knew that fighting for the scene later would be its own war. For now, he had to earn it. The night before filming, Dean couldn't sleep. He paced his room, the city's distant traffic a dull river beneath his thoughts. He kept hearing Mackenzie's stories, not as narrative but as fragments. A laugh in a plane before flak, the smell of smoke that never left, the way a man's eyes change when he realizes he can't unsee something. At 3 in the morning, he picked up the phone. He hesitated only a moment before dialing the number Mackenzie had given him. "Captain," Dean said when the line answered, voice low. "I'm sorry to call so late." "You didn't wake me," Mackenzie replied. I don't sleep much. Dean swallowed. I don't know if I can do this scene, he said. Not right, not honest. I've never been where you've been. I'm afraid of turning it into something fake. Mackenzie was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried no judgment. You're not playing a man who's lived with it for years, he said. You're playing a man who's just realized he will. That moment, everyone else had their own version of it. The moment something simple breaks open into something heavy. The moment you lose an innocence you didn't even know you were protecting. You know that feeling, that's what you play. The words settled in Dean not like instruction, but like permission. The barracks set was simple by design. Wooden bunks, bare bulbs, shadows that belonged there. They kept the lighting flat and unforgiving, nothing cinematic enough to soften faces. When Dean arrived in wardrobe, he didn't joke. He didn't perform ease. He sat on the bunk and stared at his hands, not to summon emotion, but to remind himself what they could represent. Mackenzie stood just offset, close enough that Dean could see him if he needed to, far enough that he wouldn't become a crutch. They rolled. The scene unfolded the way they had written it. A young pilot trying to convince himself he had done something good, an older one refusing to let him lie comfortably. The dialogue was quiet, the kind of quiet that pulls you forward instead of pushing at you. The older pilot spoke about survival not as victory but as residue, about how the dead do not get to argue their side. Dean listened in character, shoulders tense, eyes working to hold an idea that wouldn't stay contained. And then the line came. The one Mackenzie had given them, the one that had split him open all those years ago. We're not heroes, the older pilot said. We're the ones who lived. We're the ones who get to walk away and pretend it meant something noble. Don't confuse survival with righteousness. Dean felt it happen before he could stop it. Something in his chest loosened, and what came through his face was not something he had planned. His eyes filled, not dramatically, not with actors' tears, but with the sudden, humiliating wetness of a man who has lost a place he didn't know he was standing. His mouth tried to shape a response and couldn't. His shoulders folded in on themselves slightly, not in weakness but in recognition. When Dmytryk called cut, Dean didn't move. He sat there, breathing unevenly, staring at the floor like he had dropped something inside himself and didn't know where it had gone. No one spoke, the crew didn't rush, the boom operator didn't adjust. Even Brando, watching from the edge, stood still, arms no longer crossed. Mackenzie stepped forward slowly and sat beside Dean on the bunk. He didn't say anything at first. He placed a hand on Dean's shoulder, not heavy, not light, just present. After a long moment, he spoke quietly as if the set were no longer there. That's it, he said. That moment when you can't go back. When the truth doesn't fit where you used to keep things. Dean nodded once, unable to trust his voice. The tears embarrassed him, not because he thought men shouldn't cry, but because they hadn't been part of his craft. They had been part of something else. They shot the scene twice more for coverage, but the first take was the one everyone knew they would use if they were allowed to use any. When they wrapped, Dmytryk didn't give notes. He simply said, "Good," in a voice that carried more weight than applause. The storm came later. When the studio heads watched the rough cut and reached the barracks scene, the room changed. There was a visible shift in posture, in breathing, in the way men leaned back as if the screen had come too close. When the lights came up, the objections arrived in orderly succession. It was unpatriotic, it was depressing, it undermined the heroism of American soldiers, it would confuse audiences, it would hurt box office, it would bring protest. One man said plainly, "This scene does not belong in this movie." Dean waited until they had finished. Then he said, "It belongs more than anything else we shot." They argued, contracts were mentioned, market research was cited, responsibility to sponsors was invoked, and finally Dean said the words he hadn't known he would ever say in a room like that. "If the scene goes," he said, "I go." The room went quiet in a different way this time, not reflective, alarmed. Someone laughed softly, thinking he was posturing. Dean didn't smile. "You can replace me," he continued. "You can reshoot, you can spend the money, but if you cut the one scene that tells the truth about what these men carry, I won't help sell a lie. I won't stand in front of a camera and pretend this movie means something it doesn't." The head of production leaned forward. "You're under contract," he said. Dean nodded. "Then we'll let lawyers argue about paper. I'm talking about what this is worth." Mackenzie, who had been sitting quietly near the wall, spoke then. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Most of the men I flew with are dead," he said. "Not because the Germans killed them, because they came home to a world that didn't want to hear what they felt. That scene won't dishonor soldiers. It will finally tell the truth about them. Cutting it won't protect anyone. It will just make the silence heavier." Dmytryk surprised everyone by siding openly with them. "It's the best thing in the film," he said. And the hardest, that usually means it's the one that matters. They relented, not because they were convinced, but because the cost of not relenting had suddenly become unpredictable. The scene stayed. When Dean and Mackenzie walked out of the office together, neither spoke for a long moment. Then Mackenzie stopped in the hallway and looked at Dean with something like disbelief. "You didn't have to do that," he said. Dean shook his head. "I did," he replied. "Once I heard it, I couldn't pretend I hadn't." The film finished. The machine moved on, but something had been altered in its gears. When The Young Lions was released, reactions fractured along familiar lines. Some critics praised the performances and called Dean's work a revelation. Others accused the film of unnecessary darkness. There were protests, letters, arguments in newspapers, and there were other letters too, written in careful hands, sent to the studio, to the production office, to Dean himself. Letters from men who said, "That scene was the first time I saw myself." Letters from widows who said, "My husband couldn't talk about it, but he would have recognized that moment." Letters that did not praise but thanked. Dean kept every one of them. At the premiere, he made sure Mackenzie and his wife were seated in the front. When the lights came up after the barracks scene, Dean didn't look at the audience. He looked at Mackenzie. The old pilot's eyes were wet, his mouth pressed into a line that tried to hold something steady. When the film ended, Mackenzie stood and embraced him, and the words he spoke were not about movies or scenes or courage. "Thank you for listening," he said. "Thank you for not turning away." Dean understood then that whatever else happened in his career, whatever songs he sang, whatever laughter he sold, this would remain. The moment he chose truth over ease. The moment he let someone else's weight change the way he stood in the world. The jacket that wouldn't let him forget. The premiere lights were barely cold before the letters began arriving in stacks thick enough to bow the mail clerk's arms. They came from every direction and every kind of hand. Some were written on hotel stationery, some on lined notebook paper, some on the backs of old forms that had been folded and unfolded until the creases were soft as cloth. Many were clumsy in grammar and careful in meaning. Men who had spent years learning how to be silent were suddenly trying to build sentences that could carry what they had never been able to say out loud. Dean read them in the quiet of his home after long days of publicity, sitting in a chair by the window while California evenings slid toward night. He read about hands that shook for no visible reason, about wives who slept beside ghosts, about men who could not explain to their sons why fireworks made them leave the room. He read about relief and anger and gratitude tangled together. Over and over, different words circled the same truth. You showed something real. He had set out to be a better actor. He had not expected to become a place people tried to put their weight down. Mackenzie came to Los Angeles again a few months after the release, not for press but at Dean's insistence. They sat on Dean's back patio under a sun that was almost rude in its brightness, coffee between them, the city's low hum distant beyond the walls. They spoke about ordinary things first, whether Mackenzie's daughter's classes, the strange shock of seeing oneself fictionalized on screen. And then, inevitably, they spoke about the war, not as a subject, but as a presence that never really left the conversation even when no one named it. Mackenzie talked about the veterans he'd met since the film's release, men who had found him through letters or chance introductions, men who wanted to tell their stories to someone who wouldn't hurry them. He talked about sitting with a former mechanic who cried for an hour without explaining why, and how that hour seemed to do more than a decade of polite avoidance. "I spent years thinking the problem was me," Mackenzie said. "Turns out the problem was the silence." Dean listened the way he had learned to listen now, not with the intent to respond, but with the intent to be present. And he noticed something else too. Since the film, since the scene, since the fight to protect it, he had begun to see his own life differently. He had been careful with his image for so long, polishing it, guarding it, letting it be what people expected because expectations were comfortable. Now he felt less interested in comfort. He found himself questioning scripts that felt empty, turning down offers that wanted his smile more than his attention. It wasn't that he had lost his lightness. It was that he no longer wanted it to be the whole story. Their friendship deepened into something quieter and more enduring. Dean called Mackenzie when he was on the road. Mackenzie wrote when he didn't know what else to do with a day. Dean sent money without ceremony when he learned that Mackenzie's pension barely covered his medical bills, and he paid Mackenzie's daughter's tuition when she was accepted into college and tried to hide the fact that she didn't know how she would afford it. Mackenzie protested. Dean dismissed the protests with a wave that meant don't turn this into something smaller than it is. They were not transactions. They were acknowledgments. Years passed. The world changed. New wars entered the language. New young men were photographed in uniforms before they understood what those uniforms might ask of them. Dean watched those changes with an attention he hadn't once brought to headlines. He remembered Mackenzie's words about the machine that continues whether you step aside or not, and he felt something like obligation settle in his chest. When he spoke publicly about war after that, he did not perform outrage. He spoke about cost. He spoke about what men carried home. He spoke about the difference between survival and righteousness. The statements were not always welcome. Some sponsors disappeared. Some radio stations quietly stopped returning calls. He received letters that were not thanks but threats, accusations dressed as patriotism. He kept those too, not as trophies, but as reminders of how uncomfortable truth can be when it won't stay contained. Mackenzie's health declined gradually, the way things do when the body has been asked to hold more than it was designed for. His limp worsened. His breath shortened. Dean flew to Idaho twice just to sit with him, to walk slowly along quiet streets, to drink coffee in a kitchen that smelled faintly of old books and winter. They spoke less about the war and more about the strange tenderness of ordinary life, the way light looks on snow at dusk, the small joy of fixing something that had been broken, the comfort of knowing someone would answer the phone. On one visit, Mackenzie brought out his old bomber jacket, laid it across a chair. The leather was thinner now, the seams fragile, but it still carried that unmistakable presence. "This thing kept me alive," Mackenzie said, not literally but emotionally. "Pilots are foolish about objects. We give them power because we need something to hold still when everything else is moving." Dean touched the sleeve gently like he might startle it. "It belongs to you," he said. Mackenzie shook his head. "Not yet." When Mackenzie died, it was sudden enough to feel like theft. A heart that had worked too long around scars finally stopped negotiating. Dean flew to the funeral without telling anyone he was coming. The service was small. There were neighbors, a few veterans. Mackenzie's wife, Margaret, small and composed in the way of someone who has spent years learning how to carry grief without dropping it. Dean stood with them, not as a star, but as a man who had been trusted. When it came time to speak, he found himself not delivering a eulogy but continuing a conversation. He spoke about a man who had taught him what courage looked like when no one was applauding. He spoke about the difference between telling stories and listening to them. He spoke about how Mackenzie had spent his life trying to balance scales he believed could never truly balance, and how that effort itself was a form of grace. The people there cried not because the words were pretty, but because they recognized the shape of them. After the burial, Margaret pulled Dean aside and handed him a package wrapped in brown paper. "Jimmy wanted you to have this," she said. Inside was the bomber jacket. Pinned to it was an envelope. Dean waited until he was alone to open it. Mackenzie's handwriting was careful, slightly uneven. He wrote about weight and witness and the strange mercy of being heard. He wrote about giving the jacket to someone who understood what it represented, not as nostalgia, but as responsibility. He ended with a sentence that stayed with Dean for the rest of his life. "The real heroism isn't what you do when people are watching. It's what you refuse to lie about when they're not." Dean hung the jacket in his closet. He never wore it. He couldn't. It felt wrong, like putting on someone else's skin. But he kept it where he could see it every morning, a quiet presence that reminded him what had changed and why. When scripts came in that made violence easy and consequence invisible, he would sometimes stand in front of that jacket before calling his agent. When interviews drifted toward comfort and nostalgia, he would sometimes think of Mackenzie's voice and steer them elsewhere. The jacket did not make him solemn. It made him honest. After Dean died, his children found the jacket exactly where he had left it, along with boxes of letters from veterans and families who had written over decades. When a museum asked for the jacket as an artifact of Hollywood history, his daughter declined. "It isn't a costume," she said. "It's a reminder." And reminders, she knew, belonged where they could still do their work. The story that had begun on a soundstage did not end with a film. It lived on in conversations men had with their sons, in the way some veterans finally sought help without apologizing for needing it, in the way Dean Martin's career carried a seriousness beneath its ease that had not been there before. It lived on in the quiet understanding that art can be more than escape, that it can also be a place where truths sit long enough to be seen. Captain James Mackenzie had walked onto a set to correct a technical mistake. What he left behind was not technique. It was a door. Dean Martin had been brave enough to walk through it, to let it rearrange the way he worked and the way he spoke, and the way he stood in rooms where comfort had once been enough. Together, without intending to, they created something that outlived both of them. a small, honest space in which people could recognize themselves and not feel alone. That is not the kind of legacy that trends or fades. It does not belong to studios or schedules or even to movies. It belongs to the moments when someone chooses to listen, truly listen, and then refuses to pretend they did not hear.